So hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's lecture. Our lecturer tonight is the architect and educator, Billie Tsien. Our moderators for tonight's lecture will be Professor Ursula Kripa and College of Architecture El Paso students Karina Garcia and Daisy Porras. And one sort of official note, this lecture is approved for one CEU for AIA members only. Last time we did this, we had a lot of students apply for this. I regret to say that students are not eligible unless they're members of the AIA. So I'll begin now with an introduction to our tonight's speaker. Billie Tsien, along with her partner Tod Williams, founded their New York-based studio Tod Williams Billie Tsien Architects/Partners in 1986, although they had been working together for quite a bit longer than that. Their practice is committed to reflecting the values of nonprofit, cultural, and academic institutions towards an architecture of permanence and enduring vision. Some of their many notable projects, and there are many, include the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, the Lefrak Center in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, the Phoenix Art Museum Phases 1 and 2, and the Asia Society Hong Kong Center. Their current work includes the new U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, the Obama Presidential Library in Jackson Park, Chicago, and the renovation of David Geffen Hall's public spaces at Lincoln Center in New York City. Their extraordinary work has been recognized by numerous national and international citations, including but not limited to the National Medal of Arts from President Obama, the 2013 AIA Architecture Firm Award, and the 2019 Praemium Imperiale in Architecture presented by the Japan Art Association. In parallel with her practice, Billie currently teaches at Yale University. In addition to this appointment at Yale, she has taught at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in New York City, Harvard University, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where she was also born, the University of Texas, and the City College of New York, and I'm sure there are others that I haven't included in this list. She is also a frequent lecturer in national and international venues, and serves as the president of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and is on the board of directors for the Architectural League of New York. I want to stop for a moment and read something directly from their website, from the Tod Williams Billie Tsien Architects Partners website. I usually don't quote from a website, but I think it's very important for people in the audience to hear this, and I can think of no other or more eloquent way to speak of their work, their profound work ethos, and the remarkable significance of their efforts. So, quote, "We see architecture as a profound act of optimism, or rather an act of profound optimism. Its foundation lies in believing that it is possible to make places on earth that can give a sense of grace to life, and believing that this matters. It is what we have to give and is what we leave behind. We wrote these words a number of years ago and believe them even more deeply today. We measure the value of our work by the quiet pleasure of the lives lived in our buildings. We want to solve problems and we want to transcend solutions. We try to work with thoughtful integrity to make buildings that will last and be loved. We want to leave good marks upon this earth. This work comes from two voices and many voices," end quote. This is not the first time that Billie has been to the College of Architecture at Texas Tech. It is extraordinarily pleasurable to welcome her back again. Billie, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim, for such a beautiful, beautiful introduction. I really, really appreciate it. Well, I'm I feel honored to be talking to you all today. I feel a sort of sadness not to really be there because you are inhabiting and working from a quite amazing place, very special place on this earth. But I'll come visit you sometime when I get a chance. And, I think that time is not so far into the future. So, you always ask what is the title of your lecture before you really thought about what your lecture is. But the thinking of what one would say at a time when it felt very dark, I thought of Walk to the Light. And this first image is one of a kind of immediate light. So Jen, if you can hit the first one. It's a drawing that I did a number of years ago for a show that Tod curated called Window Room Furniture. And there is the sense of a kind of joy that we're always drawn to. And so this is a lamp, the room that you see before you sleep, that's that sense of a light, which is always comforting, which gives you a feeling of safety when you're feeling afraid. Next. But then, of course, this incredible image that is always in architects' heads, especially if you're lucky enough to visit, is of the light coming in the Pantheon. And it for Tod and me has always been a kind of something that we hold as the sense of power and grace that light can give. It's a kind of aspirational light. So there's a literal light and an aspirational light. And I think as I talk about the work, I'm going to show earlier projects where really we were talking about a literal light, and eventually we talk about a kind of aspirational light. So next. This is an early project, not the graphics of this bus map, but here you see Manhattan, and it has a sense of almost a kind of as if it were a fish that had been filleted, and of course you see Central Park in the middle of it. So next, we were in a competition where we were asked to design a bus stop for Manhattan. So the idea was that we would sort of split it like a fillet. And in the center, there is the support, and those are kind of trees coming up from Central Park. And the silk screened or adhere to the glass, the idea was that you would be able to see all the streets of Manhattan. So you could be both sheltered, but try to find yourself at the same time. Next. So here you can see this idea that the supports are coming up from the sort of roots that might be coming from the trees of Central Park. So this was a very, very early project. I think it was a kind of imaginary project, but it allowed us to think about light and place sort of tied together. Next. And then we were lucky enough to meet the sculptor Isamu Naguchi in 1991, and we were actually, this is before, we met him before, but this was later on a project that we were asked to do by a gallery that is part of NYU called the Gray Gallery, and it was to show Naguchi's work. Next. And he was primarily known, of course, as a sculptor, and so they were quite monumental sculptures. His mother was American and his father was Japanese, and he grew up in a way being a product of neither culture, but also a product of both cultures. Next. So this is an image that was taken, actually he has a studio in Long Island City and one also in Japan. And this was in the Japanese studio. And you can see here that his work is both minimal, but also very rich in texture and a sense of the hand. Next. And he also did sets for Martha Graham's choreography. So he was very involved in a number of different ways connecting the arts together. Next. And one thing he did was he made these lamps, which were called akari, and they are light sculptures. And at the time that they were made, they were quite inexpensive. They're still sold today, but they've become really very expensive because they are still handmade in a small city in Japan. But although he was criticized for making his work sort of populist, he said, no, this is a way where you can both light your room and also have a piece of sculpture. And this idea of art and use coming together, Tod, I think, is one of the sort of true aspects of architecture, where you're trying to balance both the sense of art, but it is always defined by the sense of use. Next. So after he died, the akari continues to be sold even today. Next. And when we were asked to think about these amazing and very, very different light sculptures, we thought one of the interesting things about these sculptures is certainly their form. Next. And sometimes you see really, really almost too much. You're looking at the detail of the lights. And this is Trisha Brown. She's dancing with her back to you. She was a choreographer who we knew. And I always like this piece very, very much because she chooses to sort of withhold the information of her face, as does this incredible photograph, where the person who is being photographed chooses to withhold the information of their face. It kind of gives them a power. And also one sees really kind of essence of the shape of the composition. Next. So when we did this design for a traveling exhibition, it had to move from gallery to gallery. We thought of two things. One is, how can we really show the essence of light without going into too much detail? Next. And how could we make a series of space shaping objects which could be very, very light? So we worked to make these fiberglass screens, which were next held together, stiffened by a small metal rod, and then held together really by small pieces of wood and a kind of large grommet, so they could be easily all pulled apart. So this is a show that traveled from point to point. But often you find that things that you're interested in your earlier projects, in the sort of beginning of your thinking about design, do come back to feed you in other ways that you're not aware of when you first start to work. Next. 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 So this is 8 years later, and we're now starting to think about buildings. And this is in Michigan, and it is an indoor swimming pool on a campus called Cranbrook, which was designed by Eliel Saarinen, the father of Eero Saarinen. Next. It's a very, very beautiful campus filled with buildings that have a kind of scale and detail that's really not seen, I think, anyplace else, certainly in this country. Next. There's a balance of landscape, water, architecture, and art, where they're all intertwined. One isn't really taking precedence over the other. So here you see a sculpture by Carl Millis. Next. So we were asked to make an addition to their gym, which was a swimming pool, an indoor competition swimming pool. And it's at the end of a long axis. So there's a kind of bent form which catches the the sort of end of the axis, and then a kind of square building that's set into a hillside that has these two openings in the ceiling. So it's a kind of immediate reference to the oculus, thinking about the pantheon, thinking about the power of the sky next. But at the same time, we're trying to balance that with use. So you have a kind of aspiration. You're thinking about the beauty of the sky, but you're also thinking about the use. So we had designed a swimming pool in the past. Swimming pools are generally huge mechanical drains because they're both heating the water and they're cooling the air. So the air has to be cooled so that the pool doesn't become too humid because the warm water is giving off humidity. We'd done this before and felt frustrated and thought, is there a way that you could reduce the actual load, the energy load of a building, which is inherently a kind of energy hog, by having natural ventilation? So the idea was sort of simple in that there are openings, and that's where you see those white arrows that are closed by very, very large wooden fins that are opened mechanically. And then in the roof, there are hatches which would slide back and allow the air which comes in low to vent out the top. And then that is a way of reducing the humidity and also keeping the air fresh in this pool next. So the section you can see drops the pool below the level of the grade. So on the right-hand side, you can see the grade. You sort of walk in at a middle level. And one of the things that is also important to us is a building that has a quiet presence to it, which doesn't necessarily tell you what's inside. In so many ways, I think you learn more. You start to judge people by what you see on the outside, but you really know them by what you learn from the inside. Next. So this is a very rough, crude model, which shows how thick, how deep that section is of the roof. So that's the oculus, which opens to the sky. The level where you can see a kind of plexiglass or glass railing, that is the level of the grade. Down at the lowest level, you see the level of the pool deck, and then below that is the pool itself. And that space, the thickness of the roof, allows two things to happen. One is that the ceiling, which is steel, can be inspected for rust. And the lights, which are always a very difficult thing to change over a pool, because you can imagine it's very hard to scaffold over a pool, can be changed and inspected from above. So there are a couple of reasons. Number one, of course, is drama, because we wanted the depth of that opening. But number two, once again, it's this idea of what makes sense, what is useful. Next. So I was saying that our buildings have a tendency to be quite perhaps mute on the outside. And so this is the end of the long axis where there's simply a kind of blue there. And then off to the side, you can see the wooden fins, which open and close. Next. Here, the fins are open. The building is very compressed, but that's because it's stepping down a hill. So it's actually quite a tall building, but you're only seeing it midway at the sort of belly level of the pool. Next. Next. And then here you can see the hatch is in the process of opening. And in this image, it is fully open. So we wanted to really make a difference between opening and closing. And first we thought, well, maybe we'll just have a big skylight and you'll always be able to see the light. But one of the ways that you, I think, appreciate something is when you don't always have it, when you don't always see it. So the sense of a dark opening, a dark sort of aperture when the hatch is closed, and then a kind of revealing when it opens, is part of the drama of the space. Next. 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 So this is a somewhat more recent project. It's at Bennington College in Vermont. And once again, we're searching for both a literal light and an aspirational light. This building has a very, very interesting program because it is there. Bennington is a college where for half a year, the students are sent out to do their own projects. And those projects are involved in ways of improving other people's lives. So that's why they call it the advancement of public action. And it's a place where people will come to speak. And it is a place where visitors will actually have a place to stay. And it is a place where the students chart out what their plans are before they leave the college and go out and work in the world. Next. So here, this is their mission, and it is really a place that is creating social change. And certainly we're very much in need of social change, both in terms of our society, but also in terms of our environment. So there are very big problems that are contemplated here, but I think in the end, it's a series of small actions that accrue to larger solutions. Next. So the Bennington campus is quite small. There are not that many students. And this rectangle here shows that it is the Kappa, the center, is a little off to the side from the main quadrangle. Next. It's a very simple building, actually 3 buildings. And this idea of 3 buildings rather than making one large object has a lot to do with this desire to make a space and not a thing. So when you have these 3 buildings, it's a small campus, and the place between is as important as the things that sort of sit in that space. A lot of what we think about comes from how you inhabit the interior. So our exterior or the form making that we do is often quite simple because we start always from the inside. Next. While we were visiting New England, we went to a congregational church and loved the pathway that led up to the church, which seemed to be just composed of sort of indiscriminate pieces of stone that were found here and there. And we realized later that Vermont was originally the home of a very, very important marble industry. Next. But when the diamond blade was invented, the marble industry really, really failed, at least the domestic marble industry, because prior to that, all the buildings, important buildings, state buildings, were made of granite, rather marble. But after the diamond saw was invented, people were able to cut granite, which is a much harder stone. So what you're looking at here is a man who bought the remains of quarries all over Vermont. So he's picking up these blocks of stone and dropping them in this area and just using them. Actually, he made his living cutting gravestones, small pieces of marble for Arlington Cemetery. So look at that building in the back, and you can see that it's kind of like the path. It's dry laid marble that is simply put together in a way that is about a kind of luck of the draw. It's a throw of the dice. It's whatever you found there, and you put one thing on top of another, but it's very, very beautiful and very rich. So this is where we found our granite. In a certain way, it's more sustainable than probably using old, it's where I found our marble, but it's more sustainable way of using marble because it's existing. And these are blocks that could be 100 years old, 150 years old, 75 years old from all over. Next. So the three buildings and multiple kinds of marble. It's on a kind of hill that has been created. So there's a plinth that makes a courtyard between the three buildings. Next. And this is the seminar room, which is really the heart of the center. It's where people come together to sort of figure out what they're going to do and listen to people who will come and give lectures. Next. And one of the things that was fun was that there were blocks, we called them picture stones because they carried the history of how they were cut out of the ground, and also kind of weathering that made them very, very beautiful. And so the stones were really taken as they came, and the stones move in and out. We decided that we would live and use the inability of the stone fabricator to be precise and use that as a sort of modulation of the granite. Next. So here you can see the symposium building, the places where people stay, the residences, and then a special building that's called the Lens, which has no real program other than gathering. Next. Symposium is focused around an outdoor courtyard, which brings light into all the adjacent spaces. Next. And the glass is etched because etched glass diffuses light better than clear, and it also gives a sense of privacy to the people who are inside that courtyard. Next. This is the block, which are the residences, and we tried to make actually each residence different from the other, but they share a kind of common portico. Next. One of the great things is how the rain changes the color of the stone. Next. Small rooms, but rooms with wonderful views to the hills outside of Bennington. Next. And then this building called the Lens, which I said was the unprogrammed building. And so you can see that there's this a kind of obsession with this sort of cone or bringing in light, connection to the sky. This one no longer round, much more angular, much more directed. Next. And actually much more about space making because it really impinges upon the space. There's a crank there, a hand crank, because this building is essentially off the grid. You can crank it open when you want daylight to come in. Next. Next. So this is the last project that I'll talk about, and it is, I think, once again, you'll see a kind of deep interest in light as a beacon, but also an aspirational light about making a place where people will learn. So you may notice that it says Presidential Center rather than library, and that is because Obama's presidency was essentially the first digital presidency where many and much of the correspondence was essentially digital. So the idea of papers stored in boxes in the dark no longer actually makes the same sense, and all of the work has been digitized. So it will not be per se a kind of presidential library. Next. So the first presidential library was Roosevelt's, and actually it's a wonderful one because it is part of his home in Hyde Park. They were both a kind of high design presidential libraries, the Kennedy one by Ian Pei, brutalist libraries. Johnson had one contextual libraries, which you have Bush's, and Clinton's library, which was done by Jim Polshek in Arkansas, Reagan's in California. So they're really kind of all over the map, both in terms of design and a kind of aspiration. Next. But when we presented, and it was part of a competition to President and Mrs. Obama, we, rather than show a design, we talked about ideas and words. And these two words were very important to the way we thought about the project, which is ennoble and enable. Ennoble meant that in many ways we felt his presidency ennobled this idea of what a president could be. And the focus of his work as an organizer, his work as a president, and his work really now, which he says is his most important work, is to enable people to take effect in their own sort of governments, in their own lives, in their own countries. Next. We also showed this image, which is that presidential, quote, libraries have always been about storytelling, because you're capturing 4 or 8 years of the presidency. But we felt that this center was going to be equally, if not more importantly, about story making, which is what is the future and how can you shape it? Next. So the site is in Jackson Park. It's part of a sort of string of parks that were designed by Olmsted and Box. So you can also see it's connected by this long sort of umbilicus. It's called Midway. And then Washington Park is attached at the other end. And both parks were considered as sites for the library. This is where Obama was a state senator, where Michelle Obama grew up. And it is the south side of Chicago. Next. So thinking back to the Bennington project, once again, there are 3 buildings, and this idea of making a campus, because it is a kind of more democratic space in that there is public space in between. So there are 3 buildings that come together to form a kind of plaza. We're working with Michael Van Valkenburg on the landscape architecture. And what you don't see is that there's between the 3 squares that you see and the 4th one off to the right is an underground parking garage for 400 cars. So we're also changing the topography of the park and making a kind of hillside. And the topography also comes up and comes onto the roof of the 2 lower buildings. So it is a building that is both trying to be monumental in a certain way, but also trying to be incredibly quiet. Next. So it was important to establish a landmark, and it's hard to think about what sort of monumentality means, because we are not architects that have tried to build monumental buildings, but we realize that in many ways, this presidency is about making a building that has a sense of monument to it. So then the next thing was, after thinking about a landmark, was making a campus. And so in the next image, you see that there are those 2 other buildings. Next. He was is an amazing speaker. Next. But beyond his personality are the programs. So there are My Brother's Keepers, the Obama Scholars, this whole idea that people, young people, but also people of all ages, from the neighborhood, from the nation, and from the world could come and learn about civic engagement, civic organization. Next. So here you can see the outline of that parking garage, the entire site. Next. In the tall building, which is the museum, the middle floors are going to be really a kind of museum installation. In the building called the Forum is a public space. There'll be cafe, places to just sit, hang out, have something to eat, an auditorium. And then replacing the Presidential Library will be a branch of the Chicago Public Library, because it does happen to be a kind of library desert and they need to have a public library there. So this is also thinking of a way to bring local young people in to use the public library. There are areas of green in the plaza, and those are sunken courtyards next, which bring light down to the lower level. So actually all three buildings below grade, there's one floor below grade, are all connected. And that's where the classrooms are and where some of the larger social spaces and exhibits for traveling shows are located, and the area for people who are working there. Next. This is a rendering of the plaza level, and you can see that the lower buildings have the plantings on top of them. Next. This is the entry vestibule. So we're trying to make the space feel both warm, engaging, even as it is, of course, an institution. Next. The lower level and a courtyard, I spoke about bringing light down to the lower level. So this is outside a cafe. It's a place where people will sit. So all of these spaces are free and open to the public. There is no charge to enter. Next. This is the area right off the plaza. We call it a winter garden. Next. And this is a rendering of the branch of the public library. Next. So one of the things we kept on thinking about is how this idea of the sort of monumental, the iconic, and we thought about this sort of sense of a kind of tower that was made of hands or stories, many stories. And President Obama always talks about standing on the shoulders of others, standing on the stories of others. His story, but stories to come. So this is just people in our office sort of bringing their hands together with this idea of this form. Next. But finding that form was very difficult. So we made a number of models moving from sort of one shape to another, trying to make something that didn't feel quite so mute. Next. Because one of our issues was that the museum itself was not allowed to have any natural light. So things that appear to be windows are not really windows, but are kind of window boxes, because this belly of the building is totally solid. Next. Todd and I were lucky enough to travel in Ethiopia in an area which is particularly troubled now of Tigray. And there we found this, we bought this stone, and so many things that we're lucky enough to find as we are lucky enough to be in different parts of the world come back and give us a message. So this idea of a carved stone, but with a very simple, strong shape, it's very much a way we thought about this building of stories. Next. So we make models. I mean, one of the hard things about this past year is that we haven't been in the studio, although now we're coming back, and that made it very, very difficult to make models. So we're very excited to have some people come back and start to make models in the studio. Next. So you can see that there's this textured space at the very, very top. That's a public space. It's called the Skyroom. And we had an idea of a texture or words that might somehow make a sunscreen. Next. And that would be a kind of beacon that would send a glow out and send a message. And you can see here, there's also the glow from those lower courtyards that bring light to that lower level of the campus. Next. But finally, it was decided what the words would be. So this is an image of the March on Selma 50 years ago. And then this is an image of the 50th anniversary of that march, with many people who were originally in the march, John Lewis, among others, in the march with President and Mrs. Obama, President and Mrs. Bush off to the side. Next. So it was determined then that it is the words from the speech that President Obama made at Selma, which are going to be the texture that is at the top of the building. And here we're working with Pentagram, trying to determine how they would space the words and how actually physically the letters would hold together. Next. So this will be made from concrete, and it will be a high density, lightweight concrete. And you can see there are issues when letters turn a corner. Next. But the way we always sort of figure out work is to have a mock-up made. So this is a foam mock-up prior to casting a concrete mock-up. All the letters are beveled because on one side we want it to read, but we also actually want to keep pigeons from actually sitting on the flat side. So there's always the sort of practical aspect to it. Next. And this is the image that one would see from that Skyroom as you look down to the south side of Chicago. You're looking through these words. Next. And then this image finally of looking from the roof of the library out towards the plaza to the words from the speech. And I think that's probably my final slide. I don't know, is there a next, Jen? Oh, this is the final slide. So this idea of walking to the light, I think, was truly beautifully encapsulated next in Amanda Gorman's speech that she gave at the inauguration of Joe Biden. And for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So I do feel, as I said, that in many ways, when I wrote the words "walk to the light," it seemed as if the light were very far away. And now it seems as if the light is getting closer and closer. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Billie. I think I will just let Daisy and Karina lead the conversation. You're muted.
Muted.
I'm sorry.
That's going to be the sort of, those three words, "you are muted," is going to be the sort of slogan for this entire time. It's like, you are muted.
Definitely. Based on your presentation, your work focuses on projects that serve a deeper meaning to the communities you build on. You have mentioned how the message behind each project is a lead influence on the design. Your current project with the Obama Presidential Center will break soon in the south side of Chicago, where former President First Lady Michelle Obama had grew up around. The project will either define or reflect a message through the choice of stone, textures, programmatic space, and the light placement, like as all your projects you have described. Moving on.
I wanted to say that through your work you have presented, I have noticed some unique tendencies in your work towards linear formal arrangements. I wanted to ask what unexpected and expected results have resulted in terms of materials and their application following the previously mentioned linear logic.
It's funny because one of the interesting things about, and Todd and I were just having this talk this morning, is when people are so different. And in many ways, I think I'm a linear person and he is a person without a kind of structure. And that's how we help each other, because it's very easy with the linear logic to never be able to break out of the prison of rationality. And I think Todd is very much a person who, looks at something very closely, pulls back out. It's not the kind of sequence of a sort of standard development. But I would say that what helps us the most is when we work with people who are actually making things, when we have the ability to sort of go to a quarry, when we have the ability to work with the guys that are pouring the concrete, we learn so much. And that in many ways allows us to have a structure of a kind of, a sort of the simplicity of the structure allows us to more deeply explore the potential richness of materials, which we do by trying to work with the people who actually are making things. So, sort of it's a kind of balance. One balances the other. In a way, if you're trying to work with a form so much, then the materials need to be simpler so you can emphasize the form. And right now what we're doing is we're keeping the form simpler so we can emphasize the materials.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My question was, I'm interested as a woman who's currently studying in architecture about your individual role in the creative process. How do you specifically influence the design process in your current project or in your past projects with your creative partner? Since you mentioned a lot working with him.
I think one of the things that we need to realize as architects is that we don't do everything, and that we actually have some natural strengths, because it's kind of horrifying to think that you would have to know everything and you have to do everything. In school, everybody is encouraging you to sort of, exercise all your muscles. So all muscles, have a kind of equal strength. But as a human being, you're always going to have other strengths and other weaknesses. So working with Tod, he is very interested in the sort of 3 dimensions. I'm very interested in color and texture. He's very interested in how, it's a kind of diagram, I suppose. In ideas about structure, I'm very interested in ideas about emotion. And I'm not saying that it's a diagram of what, let's say, a woman does. It's a diagram of what I'm interested in. And I think one of the important things we need to do as women is to embrace what it is that we're interested in and not make any, and not have any sense of embarrassment. I mean, to say, this is what I'm interested in, and it is worthwhile to be interested in it. That's important. It's really to sort of accept and claim yourself.
Thank you.
So there's a question in the Q&A that I'm going to read. Somebody said, thank you so much, Billie, for the inspiration, the voice, the perspective. Always wonderful to hear you speak of the work. I'm always moved by its presence of experience within it. Perhaps that comes with make of space, not a thing. Yet I feel all models and materials, studies, and central in the mix. Can you speak more about cultivating presence in the work?
I think Tod and I always, as I was saying, start kind of from the inside out. So it's, where do you work? Where do you walk? Where do you sit? What do you see? What is hard? What is soft? So there is a sense of, I think, always a human being that, is the driver. And then it's starting to be balanced with what is the budget and how does it last? Because I think it's very important to us, even if things don't last, to believe that what we do should last. And so therefore we should make it so that it should last. So it's a kind of soft, hard thing. The soft one would say that the hard is who's going to take care of it? How will they take care of it? How can we protect something that's delicate? You know, what happens to a corner? Where's the baseboard? Those things allow there to be then a greater use of things that might be delicate or materials that might be more special. Because you're taking care of the problems, you're not leaving the problems for somebody else. So, so I think, as I said, the sense of a human being who can only be ourselves, because that's all we can admit, you know, sort of put yourself in that place, is always a sort of driver for how a project moves forward. And it's kind of like bolstered up, like the retaining walls of the project is like how you make this thing last.
There's a question from Jorge Loya. He says, the demolition of the Fork Art Museum was one of the biggest heartbreaking moments in architecture for him. What are your thoughts in retrospect, and what has helped you deal with the issues like this in your career?
Well, you know, it's, you know, it remains hard, I guess, because you put your heart into something, and it was in our hometown. But I would say that, you know, I always say that Tod buildings are not children. And so one has to keep a sense of perspective. And I think architecture is a long life. That's one of the great things. I mean, thank God we're not, I don't know, athletes or ballet dancers or something where you have a very short, hard, intense life. I think architects have a very, very long life. And you hope that as you move through it, loss is, I guess, a part of how you change and grow. And losing a building is not the same thing as losing someone that you love. But the loss of both buildings and someone that you love changes the way you look at the future. And I think the way you look at the future, I'm saying this because I lost my mother in January. And I think what it did was it made me realize actually the future is now, and that you don't look back. You are very much in the sense of now. Certainly that is true for buildings. You feel sad, you don't look back, the future is now.
Thank you for sharing that. We have another question from Stephen Mueller. He says, beautiful work and presentation. Can you talk a bit more about the design and creative process as it happens at full scale with prototypes and mock-ups and on-site as your work is realized? What have you learned, and what can students learn as we move from representation of space to construction of space?
Wow, big question. I would only expect that from you, the big questions. It's interesting because it makes me think of what happened in a Zoom meeting we had last week. And we have wonderful, wonderful people in our studio who are so smart. But they were working on railing. And one of the things that happens with the ability to do so much is that you, on the computers, that you have your sense of scale is not quite as acute as when you're drawing it. You know, because there is scaleless. You don't have actually a sense of scale. So we were looking at a hand railing, and Tod actually sort of drew the handrail and the wall full scale. And there were a million reasons why it was so gross. It was too tall. It was like the handrails here. It was too fat. And the reasons, the structural engineer said you needed to do this. We wanted to clad it in this. We said that it would be good if the cladding was this thick. And so what you ended up with was not a sort of overall vision of what you believed it should be, but it was the result of an accreted series of decisions by different people. So that goes to say, understanding things full scale is super important. And when you cannot do it in real life, I mean, for us, we always feel that these mock-ups are as much for us as they are for the fabricator, because we learn things. Then you need to take some part of your project that you care about and draw it full scale. Just understand what it is that you're actually doing and how a human being interacts with it. Yeah, so I think that's where mock-ups and they truly help you to understand how big something is, because it's very hard to understand, especially when you're a student, how big something is next to you as a human being.
Question from Jim Kohler. Who developed the architectural program for the Obama Center?
Who developed it?
Yes.
The foundation had an idea of what they wanted to have the spaces be. And those were primarily the uses, with some square footages applied to the usage. But I think an important job of an architect is to rewrite the program always with an understanding of what the budget is. And we should, as architects, should understand what space needs are. So to reinterpret the program is the first step in really designing a project. So accepting the program as is without questioning it is really skipping one of the more creative aspects of, I think, what architecture is. A long time ago, when I was first starting architecture, and I probably worked for about 10 years, the entire time I kept on questioning whether I was actually going to stay an architect, because I felt like, oh, well, what I'm doing 90% doesn't feel creative to me. And I thought I was supposed to be creative all the time. And I spoke to a really wise person, and that person said, in order to feel creative all the time, you need to redefine what is creative, what is being creative. Because if you have a very narrow interpretation of what being creative means, you will be unhappy all the time. And so sometimes you need to look at what you're doing in a different light. So rewriting the program or re-understanding the program is actually a very creative act, and it has nothing to do, I think, with anything about image, but in the end, it really will sort of define what you do.
Billie, that was really a wonderful lecture. I want to ask a question I've been wanting to ask for years. I want you to speak a little bit about material, pattern, and context. And what I'm thinking about is the building at Bennington and the quarry, or the green in the concrete at the Phoenix Art Museum, and the green in the bark of the Palo Verde that are so common in Phoenix, or it seems to me the patterning in the exterior walls of the barns that seem to refer to the sycamores that line the main street. Mm-hmm. And I'm asking this because, one, I want to know how you think about it, but also because this is something that the students in the audience may not really realize is such an important part of the work.
Oh, interesting. I believe in the deep importance of peripheral vision. And so that thing that you sort of notice out of the corner of your eye versus the thing that you're trying to study or look at because you think it has the answer. And I think so many answers come from the things that are floating on the outside. So when you talked about the Palo Verde trees, it is actually, that is why that building has that color, because coming from the East Coast and seeing these trees that had a green bark was really amazing. And the Barnes patterning, choosing of the stone in many ways had to do with, a sense that original building by Paul Cray, the original home for the Barnes, was a kind of neoclassical building with these three bands, and this idea of sort of keeping these defining bands, but then breaking them because Barnes had a very beautiful collection of African textiles. And so this idea of the sort of pattern of a kente cloth and African textiles, but it's never sort of straight on like, what did some other building do? It's always much more a kind of something that comes to you from the side and surprises you. And I think that's why, architects often know so much more about, let's say, poetry or painting or dance than dancers, poets, and painters know about architecture. Because I think one of the things that we're trained to do is look. And if we leave architecture school knowing nothing else, it changes your life. It changes all of your life, all of you who are at school now, because you're learning to use your eyes in a way that you haven't before, and you will never be able to stop. So let's say you leave architecture school and you decide you're going to become, I don't know, a farmer, or you're going to become maybe an engineer, or you're going to do a million other things. You still have these eyes which look and judge. That's the bad part of architects, is that we're so judgmental, that you never can just look at anything without deciding whether you like it, whether it's, like the proportions, do you like this, is it made well? It's our eyes are now judging tools, and they're also receiving tools. I think we are very aware of how rich life is around us. So it's in many ways one of the best educations I can imagine for anything that you might want to do. You can always tell an architect because they're always looking like underneath the table, like to see, who made the table, how's the table made. Everybody else is like sitting at the table, ready to have dinner, and the architect's like underneath the table, looking at the bottom of the table.
I can only plead guilty. So
Can't escape.
it's hard. You drive your non-architect friends absolutely crazy.
Well, they can't understand why you're doing that.
But while you're walking down the street looking at everything, like,
Right.
come on, we're trying to get somewhere.
Right.
All right. Well, Billie, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture and for agreeing to be part of our lecture series. It's really wonderful. It's great to see you again. So thank you. And I hope that soon we can all visit in person at some point. So
I look forward to that.
take care.
Thank you, Billie.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ursula. Bye,
Thank you.
Corinna. Bye, Daisy. And bye, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Bye.